Good morning, and welcome to our first program in the new year. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. We are living in stressful times with the ever evolving pandemic and increasing polarization politically, socially, culturally. In times of uncertainty and fear, some people give in to the human impulse to blame those who are different from them, different from us, for society's problems, people considered to be foreign or other. For thousands of years, Jews have been a convenient scapegoat, an easy target during times of crisis, and the consequences have been devastating. Long before the killing centers of the Holocaust, there were hateful words, a sophisticated propaganda campaign reinforcing existing anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, and taking it to new extremes. Now, nearly 8 decades after the Holocaust, we again and again see the deadly effects of anti-Semitic words and symbols. Not everyone is familiar with the word anti-Semitism, but its consequences and impact are all too clear and often violent. This pattern is evident in photos of anti-Jewish demonstrations and the aftermath of deadly anti-Semitic attacks around the world over the past 20 years. To talk about this phenomenon today, I am joined by my colleague and friend, Kim Blevins-Releva, who is a teacher educator here at the Holocaust Museum. Welcome to the program, Kim.
Good morning, Edna. It's great to see you this morning.
Likewise, I wish we could be together in person.
Me too. Soon, someday soon.
Together, Kim and I will discuss when some of the most entrenched anti-Semitic lies began, how the Nazis used them to justify their persecution of Jews, and some of the ways that they continue to be repackaged and spread globally today. During the show, please post your questions for Kim in the comments section, and we'll get to as many of them live as we are able to. Now, Kim, to begin, we know that violent hatred of Jews started long before the Holocaust. When and why did some of these dangerous stereotypes take root?
Well, anti-Semitism has been around for over 2,000 years, since Christianity started as a breakaway sect of Judaism. And early Christians vilified and rejected Judaism as a way to attract followers. And after Jesus was crucified by the Romans, Christian leaders falsely blamed Jews for his death. And for centuries after, this lie was preached from church pulpits and taught in schools. And here you can see this 1943 poster from Poland, and it depicts a caricatured Jewish man as the mortal enemy of Christ.
Now, Kim, some of our viewers may have seen or heard accusations, excuse me, blaming Jews or the state of Israel for spreading COVID-19 or other illnesses. Now, as outrageous as that claim is, the myth that Jews are dangerous and spread disease is not new. Could you tell us where it began?
Well, in the Middle Ages, when millions of Europeans were dying of the bubonic plague, Jews were accused of poisoning the wells to spread the disease. Now, these accusations did not make any sense because Jews were also dying of the disease. But at that time, people didn't know about viruses or bacteria, and they were grasping for answers. Another lie that spread that came out of England in the 12th century and it spread across Europe was the accusing Jews of using children, kidnapped Christian children in ritual blood sacrifices. And these gruesome allegations came to be known as the blood libel. And here we see a picture of an example of how Jews were portrayed carrying out this supposed religious practice. False blood libel accusations were frequently the cause of violence against Jews, even in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, and they continue to circulate today, reinforcing images and visions of Jewish people as sinister and threatening.
Yeah, and as you said, even after the Holocaust, even immediately after, in 1946, the largest mass violence, mass killing of Jews in post-war Poland occurred because of a blood libel allegation in the town of Kielce. But I'd like to turn to a different stereotype, and one that maybe more of our viewers have heard, the idea that somehow Jews control the world, that they are shadowy puppet masters behind the scenes. What are the origins of this dangerous myth?
Well, in the late 19th century, anti Semitic political parties formed in Germany, France, and Austria. And their members charged that Jews were disloyal citizens, and they circulated fraudulent theories about an international Jewish conspiracy. This thinking was reinforced in a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which began circulating in the early 1900s. And it was allegedly authored by a conference of Jewish conspirators. And here we are looking at a small sample of editions of the protocols, including ones adapted to blame Jews for more recent events and to include attacks on the state of Israel. Now, despite indisputable proof that this book is a work of fiction with no basis in fact, it has been translated into every major language and continues to be distributed worldwide. It continues to reinforce the baseless conspiracy theory that a mythical group of Jews controls the media.
And I hear you when you say about it being sold worldwide. I've seen photos, recent photos in the last couple of years or right before the pandemic that friends have sent when they've spotted it on the streets of Moscow or for sale in a hotel lobby in Cairo. So this is not something obscure. It is ubiquitous in many places. Kim, I'd like to pause for a moment. We have people watching from all around the country and around the world. I think you would be glad to know that we have people watching. Good morning to you in Shakopee, Minnesota. I hope I said that right. Colton, New York, Oxford, Mississippi, Columbus, Ohio, Tullahoma, Tennessee, and also internationally. Greetings to you in Vancouver, Canada, Thessaloniki, Greece, the city of Trieste in Italy, Valencia, Spain. Also people watching from France, elsewhere in Spain, and also in Bogota, Colombia. We are so glad that you are here, and also great to see friends of the museum tuning in, like Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt. Hi, Stu. Glad to know that you are there. Now, Kim, many centuries of vilifying and attacking Jews made them an easy and familiar target when the Nazi Party formed in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War. How was the Nazi brand of anti-Semitism different from older forms?
Well, anti-Jewish ideology was elevated in the 20th century, the early 20th century, due to a widely accepted pseudoscientific theory called eugenics. Now, eugenics promoted the myth of biological races and falsely asserted that there were biological differences between the races. Now, in the Nazis' framework, Jews were viewed not only as inferior, but also dangerous because of their so-called Jewish blood. And here we see this graphic illustration from 1921, and it depicts Jews as inhuman and even predatory.
We have an audience comment from a viewer named Patricia who says, dehumanization, what a hideous word, to think that anyone could look at another person and declare that individual not human. Patricia writes, I understand that brainwashing happens with a concept, but to see any person and say not human is a lower level of evil. And I agree with you, Patricia, other than the brainwashing part. I think that we're letting people off too easy if we say that somehow they were just fed things and took them unquestionably. They were persuaded and they believed them, and in times they also fed an emotional need or answered feelings that people needed to have answered. So I hope we will explain some of that to you, but we appreciate your comment. Let's explain that a little bit more, though, Kim. The Nazis built on these and other false ideas that people already had about Jews. As we've said, there was existing anti-Semitism. But please tell us about Joseph Goebbels, the man behind the Nazi propaganda machine.
Well, Joseph Goebbels was a persuasive writer and a powerful public speaker. He was born in Germany in 1897, and he was born with a club foot, which this disqualified him from serving in the military service during the First World War. Instead, he went to the university where he earned a PhD in the study of languages, and he trained there to fight with words. Now, Goebbels was a radical anti-Semite who blamed Jews for Germany's economic problems. And he joined the Nazi Party around 1924, and at 35 years old, he was appointed by Hitler as head of the newly established Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. In that role, Goebbels controlled nearly all aspects of German culture. He controlled film, theater, music, the press, and radio. He made it his mission to spread and reinforce anti Semitic messaging throughout society. And he tailored those messages to diverse audiences, including to Germans who were not Nazis.
And I think one of the things that is often disturbing to people when we look at the techniques that the Nazis used in their propaganda is that many of the kind of tailoring you're talking about, the audience specific appeals, are still used by marketers today in the service of much more mundane or even positive services. A viewer named Rob is writing in to share a quote that is often attributed to Goebbels, which gets to the heart of his strategy to inundate German society with anti-Semitic messages. And paraphrased, it reads something like, "A lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth." And absolutely, Rob, this is the way that Goebbels and his staff and the whole Nazi apparatus decided to saturate German society. So let's take a look at some of the tools that they used to spread their hateful speech and their racism. Radio was a relatively new technology at the time. Kim, how did Goebbels harness radio's potential?
Well, Goebbels early on recognized radio's potential to influence large audiences, and he subsidized the mass production of a stylish and affordable radio to channel Nazi propaganda directly into German homes. And it was called the Volksempfänger, the People's Radio. It was also known as Goebbels' Schnauze because he often addressed the public through the radio, Goebbels' snout, as did Hitler. It sold for about half the price of the cheapest radio on the market. By 1941, 2/3 of German families owned a radio, and the Nazis' hateful and anti Semitic propaganda could reach about 50 million Germans of all ages.
So the sleek design, the affordable price, I think it's important to remember a lot of the positive reasons that Nazism might have been appealing to an average German. It felt forward thinking, advanced, cutting edge, and the radio was just part of that. And this was all over Germany, but I'd like us to pause for a moment to think about what it felt like to be a German Jew listening to this slander, because they too had radios. You have to think about the men who were veterans of the German military from the First World War, Jewish men who had proudly served their country, or little kids who were being taught to feel shame about who they were in school. More than 80 years after the Holocaust, the hateful words that came out of the radio still rang in the ears of one of our Holocaust survivor volunteers at the museum, the late Bob Baer, who at the time was 90 years old. Let's listen to Bob's recollections that he shared with students at our museum here in Washington in 2012.
One of my first impressions in the 1920s was my dear father, who had the radio on all the time. And I grew up, I become 6, 7, 8 years old in the 1920s. And what did I hear out of the loudspeaker? Nazi propaganda mixed with hatred and anti-Semitism. I remember going to my mother and saying, "Mom, what is this man talking about Jewish conspiracy? Jews haven't caused the loss of World War I. Jews haven't caused the inflation." And my mother, me being a kid, said, "Don't worry about it. You are in a free country and you don't have to worry about anything."
Now, Bob's mother and hundreds of thousands of other German Jews hoped that these rantings on the radio would remain on the fringes. But after January 1933, Nazi leaders now were at the head of government and they had the official power to act on them. Kim, the Nazis recognized the power of entertainment to spread their ideology. Could you tell us how they incorporated anti-Semitism into films, particularly into feature films, movies being shown in theaters?
Well, yes, the Nazi Party established a film department in the party, and after 1933, Goebbels' movie making became part of state-sponsored propaganda. Now, at first, these Nazi films focused more on messages like German pride and glory, rather than spreading racist ideas. But in 1938, Goebbels ordered the production of a number of anti-Semitic films. Some had subtly hateful storylines and portrayals of Jews, while others were more explicit. And here we see a photo of Goebbels alongside Hitler on the set of one of the films made during his time as propaganda minister. Now, Goebbels worked with prominent filmmakers, including Veit Harlan, who directed a movie called Jude Süß. The film was released in 1940, and it's one of the most well-known anti-Semitic propaganda films produced in Nazi Germany. Here we see promotional posters of the film, and it shows the face of a menacing Jewish protagonist. Jude Süß was stereotypically portrayed as an 18th century German Jewish financier who commits heinous crimes involving money, deception, and rape. And the dramatic execution scene at the end of the film is an attempt to justify Nazi racist policies and the need to eliminate Jews from Germany. And this film was seen by millions of Germans when it was first released, and it was successful outside of Germany as well, even winning an award at the 1940 Venice Film Festival. Goebbels also influenced the production of another famous and even more overtly grotesque film released a few months later, Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew.
We can see, looking at those promotional posters, sorry, I had to clear my throat, that the sinister nature of how Jews is being portrayed is intensifying. The Nazis are kind of ramping up their propaganda. I'd like us to take a look at the movie you just mentioned, The Eternal Jew, to see how familiar anti-Semitic beliefs and imagery were reinforced to try to evoke fear in the audience. Let's have a look.
Eine verblüffende Parallele zu dieser jüdischen Wanderung durch die ganze Welt bieten uns die Massenwanderungen eines ebenso ruhelosen Tieres, der Ratte. Wo Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land, zerstören sie menschliche Güter und Nahrungsmittel. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen. Wir erkennen, dass hier ein Pestherd liegt, der die Gesundheit der arischen Völker bedroht.
It's a really skin-crawling clip to watch. Kind of plays on our almost physical revulsion that we would feel and connect rats and Jews. For viewers who are joining us late and may have just tuned in to see that, we are looking at footage from a film called The Eternal Jew and talking about anti-Semitism, which is hatred of Jews and the ways that Nazi propaganda reinforced this hatred and suspicion of Jewish people. Now, The Eternal Jew also included documentary film footage of Nazi marches, and it ended with a direct threat, a speech, a real-life speech that Hitler gave at the Reichstag, the German parliament, on January 30th, 1939, in which he warned that what he called Jewish financiers, that if they succeeded in plunging nations into war, that the so-called Jewish race would be annihilated in Europe. So this is a directly violent and insightful movie. Kim, I'd like us to discuss, though, another way, maybe one that feels a little less over the top, daily and influential way that the Nazis were controlling the flow of information to the German public. One of the early acts of the regime was to declare war on the German press. How did that unfold?
Well, when Hitler came to power, across Germany, more newspapers were published there than in any other industrialized nation. Only 3% of these papers were controlled by the Nazi Party. And it quickly became clear to the Nazis that gaining power over this means of communication was crucial to shaping public opinion. When the Nazi state outlawed the multi-party political system, hundreds of newspapers produced by competing political parties stopped publication. And within months, Germany's free press was destroyed.
Now, the free press was crushed, right? But the Nazi media machine flourished. And there was one particularly notorious anti-Jewish newspaper that thrived. Who was the man who published it, and what kinds of stories appeared in this newspaper?
Well, Julius Streicher was originally a school teacher, and he was a passionate anti-Semite. In 1922, he persuaded his followers from a regional right-wing organization to merge with the then fledgling Nazi Party. A year later, he established a rabidly anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer, which means the attacker. And attack it did. It featured lurid tales of alleged evils committed by Jews like ritual murder, sex crimes, and financial crimes. After the Nazi rise to power in 1933, it became one of the best known publications in Germany. And here on the cover of this 1934 issue is the anti-Semitic lie of the blood libel. Underneath the headline, Ritualmord, is a reprint of a medieval depiction of a ritual murder supposedly committed by Jews. Looking at it closely, you can see the sinister-looking men draining the blood of a baby and several other young victims at the bottom. Der Stürmer was everywhere. It was sold on sidewalks and street corners throughout Germany, and it was posted in special glass cases around towns. A single special edition of this newspaper run could include 2 million copies. Streicher,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Streicher became a very powerful Nazi mouthpiece, and he continued to publish his newspaper for more than 20 years until 1945, when Germany lost the war.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I got excited when you said more than 2 million copies, because I also want to emphasize for our viewers that means many more than 2 million people reading the paper. You know, if it comes into a household, multiple members of the household might read it. It could be passed among friends or left in a cafe on a table and someone else reads it. So this is really pervasive. And Kim, even if the format of the issues that you're showing us might feel dated to our eyes, we can look at it today and understand it in the context of clickbait. That was part of what made Der Stürmer so popular, was that it was featuring these really sensational stories, but also playing on myths like the blood libel. They were already familiar to readers, and here it was more of that being reinforced. I understand, though, that Streicher's influence also extended to children, right?
That's right. He was not satisfied to poison only the minds of adults. Streicher's publishing house also printed children's books. And here we are seeing images from 2 children's books, The Poisonous Mushroom and Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and No Jew on His Oath. These taught the youngest Germans to distrust and hate their Jewish neighbors. As we can see, graphic illustrations in these books resurfaced long-established anti-Semitic lies. Jewish attempts to control the world through banks, Jews as dirty and destructive and dangerous to society, and dangerous to innocent Aryan women and children. The images are disturbing and they're grotesque, and they're hard to look at, and they definitely had an impact on the children who saw them in Nazi Germany.
And tens of thousands of copies of them were published, right? So
that's right. More than 40,000 copies of The Poisonous Mushroom alone were printed.
It's not hard looking at them to imagine the kinds of nightmares that these books would have caused in a little kid. It's not the kind of bedtime reading that one would like. And this approach and the targeting of children in particular has really struck a chord with many of our viewers. One named Kim says that when teaching and encouraging others to hate starts in childhood, it's truly, truly heartbreaking, and no one wins. And another viewer named Cheryl writes about the vulnerability of young people, saying that those who are evil clearly know that children are the most vulnerable. They soak up words and their meaning like a sponge. And have to agree with you, Cheryl, absolutely. And that's why children were targeted in particular, because they would be so susceptible to these kinds of images and ideas. Now, Kim, I want to turn us to the present day and to try to trace some of the threads that link us from then to now. The idea of using outlandish, cartoon-like characters to spread hatred of Jews did not end with the Holocaust, and similar depictions endure today. Take us to an example from an annual celebration in Belgium, please.
Yes, the 600-year-old Oust Carnival is held in northern Belgium, and it's a popular and much-loved tradition during the weeks before Easter, and it attracts about 100,000 spectators every year. In 2010, it joined the list of World Heritage Cultural Events recognized by the United Nations, and this carnival is best known for a parade with satirical floats. In recent years, the parade has come under fire for anti-Semitic depictions. This ghoulish anti-Semitic float sparked outrage by Jewish organizations in 2019. In this photo, you can see the exaggerated stereotypical facial features and a type of hat traditionally worn by some ultra-Orthodox Jewish men. And these monstrous figures have money bags at their feet, and the character on the left has a rat on his shoulder. These kinds of displays were not out of character for this parade. In a previous year, a float that resembled a rail car used to transport Jews to death camps was shown, and walking alongside it were participants dressed as Nazi officers and Orthodox Jews. Now, in response to the controversy, the mayor dug in his heels and just asked UNESCO to remove the parade from its heritage sites, which it did later that year. In 2020, the parade continued with even more anti-Semitic floats.
So absolutely unapologetic, without any shame about it. I'm struck also looking at this, Kim, by the timing of this parade that you said it's every year in the weeks leading up to Easter, because historically over the centuries, that has been a time of anti-Jewish violence and of panic and fear in Jewish communities, related to some of the myths that you opened the program with, that's the time of year when people mark the death of Jesus, and Jews were blamed for it. And also it is a common time of year when blood libel accusations would come out, because the idea was that Jews somehow used blood of Christian children to make matzah for their Passover holiday. So it's an intense time. Kim, tell us though about another example of anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews masquerading as satire, in this case in cartoon contests that have been supported by the government of Iran.
Yeah, in 2005, organizations with ties to the Iranian government sponsored the first of several Holocaust cartoon competitions, inviting entries from artists from around the world. The event has provided a platform to those eager to deny the Holocaust and to spread hatred of Jews and of the Jewish state on a global scale. And there's a deliberate strategy involved in choosing cartoons, something seemingly so light, to reach the masses.
But the intention of these contests, it's barely veiled at all. It is to attack Jews, and in particular also to attack the Jewish state. And I'd like us to take a look at the cartoon that received an honorable mention in the 2006 contest, just to kind of walk us through it and deconstruct it for our viewers. We see here a newer incarnation of the old anti-Semitic portrayals that we've been talking about as Jews as predators or killers. But here, the hunchbacked Jewish man is supposed to be an Israeli soldier. His big nose pokes out from under a military helmet, which is labeled with a Jewish star. And in place of a shield, he is hiding behind a gravestone labeled with the word Holocaust. This is a direct accusation that somehow the state of Israel uses the memory of the Holocaust to defend its actions today, a false claim. But once again, Jews are cast as conspirators, pursuing power and threatening vulnerable people. And this is not news. These are echoes from the past. Of course, there are legitimate debates to be had about conflict in the Middle East. Israelis have them with each other every day. But when, as in this cartoon, the Holocaust is invoked, or the Jewish state is somehow likened or made equivalent to Nazis, then it crosses a line into Holocaust denial and other forms of anti-Semitism. Kim, tell us about another cartoon that received a lot of attention in a more recent 2016 competition, also sponsored by Iranians.
So this is the 2016 winning entry, and it was submitted by a French cartoonist who has a long track record of creating anti-Jewish and anti-Israel themed art. Starting with the choice of a cash register, you can see the cartoonist is tapping into the stereotype of Jews being fixated on money, an idea that's hundreds of years old. The dollar amount is 6 million, which is also the number of Holocaust victims. Atop the cash register is a building meant to mimic a Nazi death camp. So we see both a very old anti-Semitic stereotype and a newer form of Holocaust denial, this idea that Jews used the Holocaust as a money-making enterprise.
So a truly perverse cartoon, but in case there was any doubt, it makes very clear that Holocaust denial is one of the newer and more popular forms of anti-Semitism. And in fact, it is the pain that the memory of the Holocaust causes to survivors and to other Jews that makes it such an appealing weapon for anti-Semites to adopt. Despite all the evidence, the records created by the Germans themselves, eyewitness testimony and photographs, there are still people who stubbornly insist that Jews have invented or exaggerated the Holocaust for financial gain, as you mentioned, or to somehow gain sympathy or power. And we can see that kind of approach on display also here in the US, here in anti-Semitic graffiti that was sprayed on a synagogue in Seattle, Washington in March 2017, again, accusing Jews of exploiting or making up the Holocaust as a means for profit. Now, these days, Kim, it is not uncommon that people with a track record of spouting anti-Semitic lies online then go on to commit more serious crimes in real life. That was certainly the case in the fall of 2018 for the gunmen who murdered 11 people and wounded 6 others, including several Holocaust survivors, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Tell us about that trajectory, please.
Well, months before carrying out the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, the shooter posted anti-Jewish slurs and conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the nation and being responsible for allowing immigrants into the country online. And according to a neighbor, a number of immigrant families had recently moved into his neighborhood. And on the morning of October 27th, he put his hatred into action. He entered the Tree of Life Synagogue shouting anti-Semitic slurs while members of the congregation were gathered in prayer, and he murdered 11 people. He was someone who found community online that reinforced his dangerous beliefs. And it's a stark reminder that online hatred can bleed over into hateful acts in person with absolutely devastating consequences.
Hearing you talk, Kim, about the way that shooter found fuel for his anger online and in social media reminds me that I recently spoke with one of the early pioneers of online racist extremism, a man named Derek Black. Derek Black was born in 1989, and he grew up in a family that was influential in leading and shaping the white supremacist movement in the United States for decades. And we see here a cute picture of Derek as a little boy. But from birth, he was groomed to one day be the leader of a racist white supremacist movement, and was taught that Jews threatened white society and that people should be separated because so-called other races might contaminate them and their dominance. Derek's father in the 1990s looked to the latest technology, the burgeoning internet, and he created a website to spread his ideas and to attract new recruits. Derek has told us that when he was just 10 years old, he decided to learn web coding, and he created a special section on his father's website to spread white supremacy and racist ideas to children and teens. If anyone understands what fuels this kind of extremist movement, it's Derek. Let's hear him describe how central anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is to white supremacist thinking.
White nationalists talk about their hatred of Jews as much, if not more, than they talk about their belief in race and their desire for global segregation. There is almost no white nationalist movement without this fundamental idea that Jewish people in the world are actively engaged in a global conspiracy to embrace immigration. This belief that Jewish people hate quote unquote white people. It's always anti-Semitism that is at the center of this whole ideology.
And a viewer named Carol comments that unfortunately, white supremacist ideas are still with us and have an eager audience of followers here in the US. Carol, I wish I could disagree, but of course you are right. But I do want to note that Derek himself publicly and courageously renounced white supremacy in 2013. And today he is a committed and outspoken advocate for anti-racist beliefs and has also become a scholar of the medieval and early modern origins of the ideas of race. Derek is an example that someone's views can change no matter how deeply entrenched they might have been. And I hope he gives us all some cause for hope or optimism. Now, Kim, you were a classroom teacher for many, many years. And you know, and we know how influential social media can be, especially for young people. Increasingly, it's how we communicate with one another, it's where we get our news, and also where a lot of anger goes viral. Let's take a look at some of the anti-Semitic memes that are circulating. And the voice we're going to hear in this next video is from a high school teacher in Texas describing the kind of material that her students run into online.
I've heard keywords and some of the same old stereotypes. Globalists or the bankers are, and then some will say something like, well, you know, the Jews are running the world. These are real stereotypes that people still believe today.
We have a comment from a viewer named Lissa saying that it's chilling to think of how the Third Reich would have used social media if it existed back then. And indeed, they were what we would now call early adopters. The Nazis were early adopters of technology and also of mass communication. Now, we also have a question, Kim, from a viewer named David who asks, are we experiencing this propaganda phenomenon currently? What can we do to counter it? And I'd like to take it further, Kim, and build on David's question. You work with a lot of teachers as part of your outreach on behalf of the museum. How do you think that the history of the Holocaust can help their students to better understand the dangers of online anti-Semitism?
Well, teachers across the country are telling us that their students are exposed to anti-Semitic imagery and that they need help explaining why certain images are offensive and dangerous. And the museum has lessons that define anti-Semitism and tools to analyze images on social media. Now, when students talk about memes in the classroom with images like the ones we just saw in the video clip and that we've seen throughout this program, it can be an entry point for a deeper conversation. It's also an opportunity to exercise critical thinking skills that extend beyond the classroom. Taking time to carefully analyze images and messages that you see on social media platforms is vital for all of us, not just for students in a classroom. And you can really start this by first understanding the difference between belief, opinion, and fact. Which of these is social media the best at portraying? And then take time to carefully look at the images. Who created it? What's being asserted? Why would they create it and want to share it? And most importantly, is there any credible evidence to back up what's being asserted in the image or the meme? It's really essential that we look critically at all information that we see online, whether we agree with it or disagree with it. I did this type of unpacking of memes in my own classroom, and it led my students to be able to recognize anti-Semitic tropes and other forms of discrimination. It just takes time and critical thinking and the willingness to engage with difficult material that you may agree with or disagree with. We know that the Holocaust started with words, and it is essential to the health of our democracy that we are willing to think critically about the messages that we see online or here in person and be able to understand what it is we're seeing.
Well, thank you, Kim, for walking us through step by step the kinds of questions that we might pose to ourselves or with a young person when looking at this kind of hate content. And just as a piece of validation for you, we have an audience comment from a woman named Stephanie Helfrich saying, thank you for your excellent lesson plan on this topic. It was the most impactful instruction I did in the unit, and the kids really responded to it. So I hope that makes you feel good, Kim.
That is great to hear. That is wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and we really appreciate the feedback and are glad that it's useful. Kim, we are just about out of time, but I want to thank you for spending your time with us today and sharing your insights into how we can draw these lines from the past to today and try to be alert to what's swirling around us.
Thank you so much for having me, Edna. It was a pleasure.
I can also say that as the parent of 2 teenagers myself, I know one of the things they most resent is if they ever feel like they're being played, that they're being used as suckers. And I think by being literate in and educated about older hateful stereotypes and myths and lies, we can recognize when they're being repackaged or kind of skillfully masked so that we don't inadvertently pass them on, repost them without knowing that we're being complicit in that kind of act. And even though the lies that we have seen are being changed, updated, and they morph as new technologies emerge, many of the messages remain disturbingly consistent and dangerous, so we need to all be on guard against them. I would like to close the program with a comment from a viewer named Jean, who reminds us to never forget how many people were murdered because of these lies. Thank you, Jean. They're not just abstract ideas. They represent human beings and pain and loss, and we will keep that sentiment front and center when thinking about this. We invite you, our viewers, to join us again for our next program on January 27th, which is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, when we will have a special program with Holocaust survivor Aryeh Efrat. From the moment that Aryeh was born in 1942 in Slovakia, he was in danger as a Jewish child. We will hear from him how others' choices and sacrifices helped him to survive the Holocaust. We hope you'll be with us again then. Until then, be safe and healthy wherever you are. Bye-bye.